All right, so at the end of the war, the United States and its allies really kind of wind up conducting the terms of peace in the post-war world. And Wilson goes in with a very defined plan, and throughout the negotiations, he gets some of what he wants. He doesn't get other things. And what emerges, the Treaty of Versailles, is really one of the uh, weak points for the next couple of decades, and actually you could argue directly contributes to the beginning of World War II. So we're going to talk about Treaty of Versailles and also the political controversy over the treaty at home. So Wilson's plan for world peace was the 14 points. And he gave a speech to Congress right before the war ended where he outlined a vision of what he called a just and lasting peace. His plan was called the 14 points, and among its ideas were open diplomacy, which meant no secret treaties, freedom of the seas, removal of trade barriers, free trade between all nations, and the reduction of military arms. He also wanted a fair system to resolve the disputes over the colonies, former German and Austrian and Ottoman colonies. He called for self-determination, or the right of people to decide the fates of their own nations or to form their own countries. And he also wanted to establish a League of Nations, an international organization that would work together to settle disputes in order to prevent future wars. 14 points expressed his philosophy of U.S. foreign policy. 14 points declared that foreign policy should be based on morality, not just what's best for a nation. So it was a departure from foreign policies as they were practiced by many nations, including the United States at the time. So the Paris Peace Conference is convened to try to come up with a treaty for the war. President Wilson led American negotiators attending the peace conference, and this makes him the first U.S. president ever to visit Europe while still in office, strangely enough. Republicans criticized Wilson for leaving the country when the nation was struggling to reestablish its peacetime economy. But he had a dream of international peace, and he believed this required him to attend the conference as a fair and unbiased leader to prevent the squabbling of European nations. Peace conference began on January 12, 1919, and leaders representing 32 nations, about 3/4 of the world's population, attended. Leaders of the victorious Allies, President Wilson, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and French Premier Georges Clemenceau attended, and also Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. And these four leaders become known as the Big Four because they become the main people to craft the treaty. Germany and Austria-Hungary and Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, the Central Powers, were not invited to attend. So the delegates all arrived at the peace conference with competing needs and desires. President Wilson had this vision of a better world. He wanted nations to deal with each other openly and fairly, and he wanted military arms reductions for everyone. However, some allies wanted to punish Germany and take revenge for its role in the war, specifically the French, led by Georges Clemenceau. He accused Germany of tyrannical conduct, and he said this is exemplified by a huge loss of life and the continuing suffering of veterans. Other leaders, such as Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, wanted their own nation. Poland was another country like this, which had been divided between Germany and Russia. And then you had people that weren't participants in the conference, but that were pressuring for independence and freedom in their own right. Ho Chi Minh, who at the time was working at the Paris Ritz Hotel, for instance, wanted Vietnam to be freed from French colonial control. And we'll see, of course, this is going to have impacts later on with the Vietnam War. The agreement that the Allies come up with is called the Treaty of Versailles, and it's presented to Germany in May. And the treaty was much harsher than Wilson had wanted. It required Germany to disarm its military forces. It required them to pay $33 billion in reparations, which are payments for the expenses caused by the war. Germany could not afford these, and it also forced Germany to sign the war guilt clause, which basically they assumed sole responsibility for starting the war. The Central Powers also had to turn over their colonies to the Allies, which stayed under Allied control until they become independent. The treaty did include some of Wilson's 14 points. Creation of a League of Nations was in there, and there was some limited self-determination for some ethnic groups in Eastern and Central Europe, although Middle East and Asian and African colonies were not granted that same self-determination. Germany strongly protested the treaty, but basically was forced to sign it after France threatened military action. Wilson returned to the United States and presented a treaty to the United States Senate, which has the constitutional duty or responsibility of approving all treaties, and he needed the support of both Republicans and Democrats to ratify it. However, very quickly it became obvious that Wilson was going to have trouble getting Congress's support. And there are basically three different groups of senators that developed. One is the Democrats, who almost all supported the immediate ratification of the treaty. You had the irreconcilables, who just wanted to not approve the treaty at all, to reject it and reject U.S. participation in the League of Nations. Then in the middle, you had reservationists, who were led by powerful Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who would only ratify a revised treaty or only ratify a treaty that had been revised. Reservationists thought that the League of Nations Charter required members to use force for the League, and they thought that conflicted with Congress's constitutional right to declare war. So there was controversy over the treaty, and almost from the beginning it becomes obvious it's going to be difficult for Wilson to get it passed. Wilson stubbornly refuses to compromise with the reservationists and decides to take his case directly to the American people. He travels 8,000 miles across the country in 22 days. He makes 32 major speeches urging the public to pressure senators into ratifying the treaty and warning of serious consequences and even further war if the nations didn't work together. Wilson's heavy touring schedule weakened him, and in October of 1919, he suffers from a stroke, during which time he cuts himself off from friends and allies, as well as other visiting political leaders and dignitaries. In September of 1919, shortly before Wilson had a stroke, Senator Lodge had presented a treaty to the U.S. Senate, which included a list of 14 reservations or concerns about the treaty itself. Wilson again was unwilling to compromise, and the Senate rejected Lodge's treaty on Wilson's instructions. Senate Democrats opposed it almost completely. And of course, the irreconcilables weren't going to vote for any treaty regardless. So Wilson spends the rest of his presidency much of the rest of his presidency bedridden and kind of hidden away from the public. His wife conspired with his doctors to hide the extent of the damage caused by his stroke, and many historians have indicated that, in fact, Edith Wilson, his wife, may have carried out some basic functions of the presidency during his illness. Anyway, after Wilson leaves office in 1921, the U.S. signed separate treaties with each of the nations of the Central Powers, but they never joined the League of Nations. And the United States' refusal to join the League of Nations is going to severely weaken the League's position and ability to enforce peace. Again, U.S. participation in the League's ability to keep world peace is going to be more uncertain going forward. The impact of the war is massive in the United States. Politically, throughout the world. Politically, it led to the overthrow of monarchies in Russia, overthrow of the monarchy in Austria-Hungary and Germany, overthrow of the Sultan in Turkey. So all these old monarchies that were still holding power in Europe and the Mideast basically are overthrown. It also contributed to the rise of the Bolsheviks, the communists, to power in Russia in 1917 and 1918, and it fanned the flames of revolts against colonialism in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Some of these areas that wanted independence and were not granted that independence began to revolt against their colonial masters. Economically, obviously, it devastates Europe. Europe is unable to recover from the effects of the war for decades, and as a result, the United States emerges as the world's major economic power. However, the United States still faced problems. Inflation left people struggling to afford everyday normal items, and farmers whose goods had been in high demand and who'd been guaranteed high prices during the war found after the war that they were overproducing and there was less demand for their products. Finally, socially, the war was obviously a huge impact. The war killed 14 million people and left over 7 million men disabled in Europe. I mean, it was a huge scar on Europe, not just physically, but psychologically. I mean, an entire generation of men is more or less lost. Of European men is more or less lost to Europe, whether dead or physically or mentally broken. It has huge ramifications moving forward. It also, especially in the United States, draws millions of women into the workplace, which helps women pressure, gives them a stronger case from pressuring for the passage of the 19th Amendment to be allowed the vote. It also expands the ideas of what women were capable of at the time. It also encouraged African Americans to move to northern cities for factory work. And we talked about this in the last video lesson, the Great Migration. And it caused dramatic shifts of racial populations dramatic racial shifts in population throughout the United States and to a lesser degree Europe, but specifically the United States when we're talking about the Great Migration. And again, the impacts in Europe were even greater. The effects of World War I in Europe are devastating. European nations lose almost an entire generation of young men. France was in ruins. Great Britain was deeply in debt and lost its place as the world's financial center. It was replaced by the United States. And the reparations forced on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles crippled its economy. So even though many people at the time called World War I the war to end all wars, too many issues were left unresolved by the Treaty of Versailles, and it actually fostered anger and hostility amongst the nations that were involved. So within a generation, conflict again would break out into Europe and bring the United States into another world war. And of course, we'll talk about World War II later on. Actually, you'll talk about in the next portion of the class in U.S. History C. But massive changes worldwide, and what we're going to see is in the next unit as we move forward, we're going to talk about the next chapter as we move forward. We're going to talk about how those impacts play out in American society and impact the United States. So we'll talk to you guys then. Bye.